Uh, so thank you, and I'm really happy to be here and happy to learn and eager to have conversation. And I really just, per George's urging, put together some slides to just give you a sense of the things that I'm interested in and what kind of the context in which I'm working. So let me just do that for 15, 20 minutes or so, and then we can open it up, but we can also run me as I'm doing that. So my interest is in the whole person. That's what I was presenting on yesterday at ELI. And here's 2 or 3 ways to think about the questions that I think about all the time. So at the educational level, I like to think about this, if we're designing liberal education, and I use that term very broadly to encompass, I think, what we just think of as a university education. At this moment, what would it look like? Higher education rarely gives itself the freedom to ask that question because we feel like we're such in reactive mode. But if, knowing everything we know about learning, everything we know about the current system, everything we know about the challenges facing us, like what would it look like if we could design it at this moment? Last 4 years, I've been co-teaching a course called The Future of the University as a Design Problem. I co-teach it with an architect to undergraduates, and they try to imagine what the university would be like in the year 2033. So I'm very much driven by the question of how can we put the whole person at the heart of higher education, because I think that this is both a way to kind of in a very urgent way counteract the movement toward disaggregation, which I think is pressing on us from many different directions, including one version of the digital ecosystem. And I also think that this is really an urgent part of the equity question of what it means to create a liberal education or higher education that's available to a broadened community of people who need education, and that everyone should have access to a whole person education. And I'm especially interested, as you guys are, you're here at Link, in how do we use the whole learning ecosystem, especially the emerging digital ecosystem, as a way of helping everyone cultivate a sense of purpose, authenticity, and well-being in education. And to me, part of what it means to take a whole person approach is to keep things like purpose, authenticity, and well-being at the core. So one of the projects I've been working on is something that we call Formation by Design. We put out a project report that was kind of a landscape scan and trying to ask the question, formation is a very Jesuit term. I teach at a Jesuit and Catholic school, so we use the word formation to mean whole person learning. It has a very rich sense of a kind of continuous process of how you help people embody their knowledge through action in the world. So it's very much a way of connecting your learning to action in the world, which is another reason I really like formation. But as we were discussing before, some people find the word formation to be scary, or it feels like we're trying to do something to people. But the premise of Formation by Design, and this is our sort of mission statement, was to respond to the challenges of the current landscape poses to an integrative and a holistic vision of education by creatively designing dimensions of the university to ensure that formational learning or whole person learning can both thrive into the future and be extended to an ever-expanding and diversifying population. And part of what I was observing is that the people who spoke the language of whole person or formation, this is why I think the work that George and everyone here at Link is doing is so extraordinary. But for the most part, the people who were speaking whole person-ese, like, were the least technological people. And many of the people who were speaking technology-ese were the least holistic people. And so Formation by Design was really an attempt just to ask, what does it mean to think about these two things together? To write a different narrative out of the current ecosystem and to do it in language that's really consonant, the richest, most robust.
They're doing a video.
So that's what Formation by Design is. And
make sure my audio is
it has many pieces to it. One of the places where we started at Georgetown, as we started to think about this, was to take up the question of what do we consider to be some of the outcomes that we think are most important to a formational approach to education. And this was partially spurred by our provost, and at a moment when the Obama administration was threatening scorecards on, employment statistics, first year income, et cetera, 20-year ROI. And we said, well, we believe that we're actually, nobody doesn't want to be succeeding at those metrics, but that's not what we're entirely about. And then we said, well, if we want to be measured by something else, we want to measure our impact some other way than we would be measuring it by. So this is where we started to develop this vocabulary that we felt got to the heart and soul of what we were about. We called it the Magis measures. Magis is a Latin term that's very important to the Jesuits that means the more, always trying to excel and do more. So this is called the Magis measures. So those are 5 areas that we've started to look at, and there's sort of a set of cross-cutting traits that go along with it, and these will all be familiar terms to you, and that in various, certainly some of them getting a lot of attention in higher education, whether it's grit, perseverance, collaboration, things like that. Some of them, like moral discernment and ethical judgment, maybe have a stronger valence in a place like Georgetown, but who could be against discernment and judgment? And what we have tried to do with these outcomes first and foremost, we did 2 things. One was we created, or we kind of cobbled together, a psychometric instrument that we could administer to students to try to get a sense of these these traits. My boss, the provost, his previous job before being our provost, he was the director of the U.S. Census. So he's kind of into data. and, so he said, let's create an instrument. So we cobbled together 2 instruments, one of which was something called the Clara instrument that was created by Ruth Deacon Crick, who's an education person in the UK. It had been called something before, Ellie. It's now called Clara, and in which this was an instrument in which you asked a set of 49 questions about beliefs and your self-report of resemblance to those beliefs. And then it creates this spider diagram readout along these particular measures, and she's done huge amounts of testing with it, where then the spider diagram becomes an object of conversation between mentors and mentees. We haven't really used the spider diagram, but we use the instrument as a way of getting at many of these traits, and then we put it together with another instrument called the Socially Responsible Leadership Scale. So we've administered that to our incoming freshmen twice and to our sophomores and seniors. I'm not sure if that's what we're going to get, but that was our first attempt at a kind of quantitative attempt. Second thing, the way that we've used it is we've tried to understand how these could be a common vocabulary that could be used across the institution. So we've been working with our student affairs people, our academic affairs people, to think about how this is a way of getting them to talk about common goals, whereas they usually talk about entirely different outcomes if you're talking to faculty and student affairs people. So our entire residential life staff has recalibrated all of their learning goals for their programming around these traits. Our Center for Social Justice has redone all of their evaluations of the impact of service learning programs on students around these traits. We've run workshops with faculty on assignment redesign, where we work with these traits and ask which of these are already at work in your class and how could you modify major assignments in your courses so that they're attending to these. So that's kind of the curriculum. The other research piece that we've advanced on around formation by design has been in a partnership with Simon Buckingham Shum, who's now at the University of Technology, Sydney, and turned out to be one of the few people in the world interested in analytics and dispositions like me. And so we've been partnering with him, and one of the things we've been trying to do, this is a learning analytics and knowledge conference paper that's being given in March, in part of our collaboration, is trying to look at whether machine parser could recognize and give feedback on written reflections by students. So it's like the kind of writing analytics parsers that people are using to look at writing, but we were specifically interested in the question of reflection and kind of human reflection on changes in behavior. And we've been running a program at Georgetown for many years where we have faculty incorporate modules around student interior well-being into academic courses, like 1 week, where we look for an organic connection between student well-being and the intellectual material of the course. And there's always a reflection that's written at the end of that unit. So we have almost 10 years of reflections. So that was our corpus, and we were using those in the machine parser to see if the machine could recognize what a reflective statement looked like, what a authentic or deep reflection looked like, and whether you semantically machines could recognize sort of shifts in attitudes and transformations. This is a project that gives many of our colleagues information by design the deep willies, but to me this is just one of many possibilities of how we could create kind of collaborations with different sorts of analytics to try to deepen and centralize form of reflection and ongoing growth in the higher education. All of this is sort of set against the backdrop of a broad notion of liberal education that I think is, to me, the context of whole person learning. And this is a sort of three-dimension construct that Don Harward talks about, that liberal education has always, or originally, was really focused around all three of these areas: the epistemic, which he divides into knowing that, knowing how, and judgment; the psychosocial, which is well-being; and the civic, which is where people learn deeply enough to move out of themselves. And he's talked about the psychosocial and the civic as being the exiled aims of higher education. And so very much our approach to sort of formation whole person learning is thinking about how all three of those things can be not just brought back into higher education, but integrated. Again, not seeing that like all the faculty's job is just to do the epistemic, and we have to keep funding the marginal co-curriculum to do the other two things, but how can we increasingly bring those two things together? So that's the work that we do both in formation by design by trying to work largely and out of this project that I run called Designing the Futures of the University. That's one of the things that I do as Vice Provost. We operate out of this little red townhouse that's block off campus, so it's going to be known as the Red House, our funky little startup space. And we do all kinds of curricular projects that are trying to reshape the Georgetown model, to think about how, if you're changing your curricular practices, you can keep whole person learning at the center. What would it mean to track and measure for that? I just want to mention one project, and I'm not going to talk about any of the curricular projects, but I certainly could. We're working on what many of you may have heard of, I'm sure some of you know well, this notion of domains of one's own, this movement to give every student their own domain space and a palette of tools by which to learn how to build it out. And what we're doing with our domains project is we're trying to essentially think about a kind of paracurriculum that walks students up a ladder that begins with digital presence, so using the domain space first to just have a presence on the web, and then starts to think about what are the dimensions of digital fluency, which would include understanding who's collecting your data, privacy settings, and possibly even this API, where students start to set their own permissions on who can use their data, including the university, sort of area by area. And then the highest, or the most robust category is what we're calling digital agency, which is not only how to make use of a networked world to get work done at a very high level, but part of a dashboard, student-curated dashboard project, which to me, sort of listening to all your conversation about Fitbit devices and feedback and things, that to me is the standard for a student-curated dashboard, is how can we empower students to see data on their own behavior that ultimately changes their behavior. And so the design charrette that we're running here in the spring is asking students to start to think about that. So they're all walking that ladder, but they all have to pick one goal or habit that they want to track and to identify either quantitative or qualitative evidence around that part of their life, and to track it inside their domain space. Can I talk for 5 more minutes? Sure, by all means. So I just wanted to mention, so that's kind of the work I'm doing in Georgetown, and then this is a little bit of the talk that I gave yesterday to ELI, work that I've been doing with Brett Hyman, who's kind of my counterpart at LaGuardia Community College, so a very different institution. But we're putting the finishing touches on this publication called Open and Integrative, Designing Liberal Education for the New Ecosystem. And what we're trying to do in that is sort of reframe the conversation about higher education. And these are the 3 ways that I talked about it yesterday, shifting from thinking about digital tools to thinking about the whole ecosystem, to try to shift the conversation from unbundling to rebundling, and then to think about how in a rebundled higher education, the concept of the whole person is then really critical. So let me just share with you briefly our logic here, and then I'll stop. Part of what we think is happening that's very bad is that there's all these pressures on higher education that you're all quite familiar with: decline in public funding, expanded access to new kinds of students, pressure on accountability, rise of the digital, et cetera. That's creating this unbundling discourse in which the claim is that unbundling is the key to equity. That's then building on top of higher education, which largely has construed education, except in the most privileged settings, as largely a narrowly academic trait. So to me, the bad combination of the last few years has been narrow academic aims and siloed environments, plus a commodified version of what's possible out of the digital ecosystem. And what we're suggesting is that really the tension, the central tension of this moment in higher education is between an integrative and a disintegrative vision of education. And the way that we conceptualize that is in these 2 columns. So on the left, this is what is really driving the commodified space in higher education. The design of discrete or granular learning experiences, relatively elementary competencies, learning that's decoupled from formal boundaries, and kind of analytics tracking narrow learning. All of this can be put to wonderful effect in all kinds of ways through adaptive learning, whatever. I want to be really clear, this is not a chart of good and evil. Evil on the left and good on the right. On the right is a much more integrative notion of curricular, co-curricular learning, knowledge, skills, dispositions, trying to imagine learning as a whole, but experience in the whole learner. As I joked yesterday, hundreds of millions of dollars of venture capital pouring into the left, hundreds of dollars of venture capital pouring into the right. So when we say rebundling, what we mean by rebundling in the simplest form is what it means to put the disintegrative in service of the integrative. And that's really the project of the next decade, I think, in higher education. It's how do we understand the disaggregating granular aspects of the digital ecosystem and put it in the service of an integrated vision of whole person learning. Just the last thing, this is like a super short version of it, is that we propose that there's a set of things that we talk about how that could be pedagogically, but this is what we think of as the 4 principles for driving toward a rebundled institution, is to think to be learner-centered, which is about student empowerment, not just about skills and knowledge, fully networked in the sense that you're really putting social learning and community at the center, where it's mostly marginalized, integrative, maximizing connections and coherence, and then adaptive, where an institution is continuously adaptive and a learning organization. So that's really to me, the sort of the most macro view of what it looks like at higher education, to think about how we can keep a vision of the whole person at the center. And to me, the shift is from what has in traditional institutional legacy education been the concept of the whole bundle, which has largely been segmented and compartmentalized in its pieces, but we conceptualize it as a whole, shifting from the whole bundle to the whole person. And if the whole person becomes the unit of analysis, and we expect a kind of integrative impact on as many learning experiences as possible, then we can play with the agility and the personalization of reimagining how the pieces fit together so that it's affordable and it's equitable. So that to me is why the urgency of a conception of the whole person. I think the work that you're doing is so important. What we're dabbling at in formation by design is we can't possibly keep the whole person at the heart of higher education if in many different ways we can't measure what that looks like. If we cannot talk about that systematically through evidence, then we cannot keep it seriously at the heart of higher education.
Thanks, Randy, for that overview to your thinking, and certainly on the ground, I think yours is an example of initiatives that aren't common at all, being systems that are willing to take a hard, focused look at what's changing, what it might look like going forward. So I'll direct, anybody can certainly ask questions, so just dive in, but I'll start with just a few quick questions based on our existing research. So we have a postdoctoral fellow, Troy Campbell, who's working specifically on the impact of changes in the labor market and how that might impact the future of the university. So how do you respond to then the narrative that we're hearing around education is for work and for employment? How does the model that you're putting forward relate to that?
I think we would assert that people who are educated holistically are more likely to succeed in the workplace as much as they're likely to flourish for their entire lifetime. I think that there's plenty of evidence that even if the skills that you might need on your first month in the job are very targeted, that what you need to succeed, to advance, to be promoted, to change jobs, however many times the research says people change jobs in all professions and careers, that those wider dispositions are really what make people competent. These are not luxuries. These are not outcomes of privilege. That I think that this is really a fundamental definition of what competence looks like. So I'm very interested in your perspective on that, but I think that we would assert that this is what every worker as well as citizen or person needs.
Also, soft skills, hard skills, conversation. Soft skills is more of a holistic view of a person. And with technology taking away basic jobs, how does the individual survive in a technological workplace environment? You need to be able to relate to each other, to be able to negotiate, conversations and strategize. And I think the holistic person is more able to.
Yeah, I mean, if you believe, Levy and Murnane and the predictions about workforce, et cetera, and they say that there would be three kinds of tasks left to humans, other level tasks: non-routine problem solving, complex communication, and working on unscripted problems. And it seems to me that what it means to be able to thrive in those situations requires dispositions around learning and agility and creativity and collaboration, not to mention, empathy and judgment.
So, the thing is, we acknowledge that. People driving a conversation about skills for employment, the Silicon Valley folks like Udacity being one, certainly state governors being others, the people who are making the technology and allocating the dollars, do they believe that?
They believe it for themselves. Google says, he's looking for people with humility, looking for programmers with humility. That's how he differentiates one programmer over another. I think that there actually is employer evidence of a bunch of this. And in fact, when you ask employers, they will often talk about traits that are not strictly instrumental. In fact, many of them will have a broader view of education than students have of what they think is important. And I think talking to employers is different from the people driving the commodified technology conversation. I think that one of the ways that we have let Silicon Valley write our story is that only some narrow range of technologies are scalable and commodifiable. And that's only a piece of what that whole ecosystem is like. So I think it depends who you're talking to now. Whether state legislators believe that, that's another story. See the breadth of that. But I think that's, and I don't want to be talking so much, but I think that that's also why taking this really intrinsically integrative approach to learning is so important, because there doesn't have to be a sacrifice of what it is you're teaching people. One of the examples I talked about yesterday was this amazing work they've done at LaGuardia Community College, where they have used a StatWays package and adaptive learning and tremendous faculty development curriculum reform. They now take their students through developmental math and a college credit-bearing statistics course in one semester. This is unheard of at the community college level, all built around complex problems. It's teaching statistics around food justice and climate change, et cetera, all calibrated to curricular outcomes around inquiry, global learning, and integration. There's no sacrifice between these broader dispositional kinds of things and teaching students stats. So I think, but I think if you see that it's all additive, then you are creating a much more expensive education. That's why we have to do it in curriculum.
And I'll have a follow-up question, and anybody else can jump in. But so another area that an important point that you make toward the end is that if we don't have some way of assessing or evaluating some of these things, I mean, that's the nature of society today. You get research dollars for evaluative or knowledge expansion activities, not so much for sitting in a corner and thinking. So we had a few folks recently went down to Wisconsin to spend a bit of time looking at some of the research they're doing in the Center for Healthy Minds, and getting a way to hang some numbers, for lack of a better word, on complex things that are social in nature, or things like mindfulness practices. So we have Catherine who's doing some work within Link, specifically around the attributes of mindfulness that we think, at least going forward, are going to have some kind of an impact on quality of learning. But ultimately, this all centers really around the whole person, or the well-being of an individual. And more broadly, what does it mean to be a human in a digital age? So what do you think from these particular skills that you've identified here, which ones of those, long story short, we're able to get at complex soft problems, such as things that, how do you quantify a successful moment of prayer? I mean, these are kind of hard to do, but we can do a few things, let's say, around mindfulness practices, or you use the term the life of the interior. We can get at some of those factors at a certain degree, but which ones do you think are most important for us to begin to understand or measure in order to gain the confidence of those same people, the state legislators and others, that we want to support a whole person objective?
Well, and I think that it's an interesting conundrum what it is that we're trying to measure at such a macro level as like education. And when we think about our impact on measures like the Mondes measures, we are still, I think, feeling our way is, are we trying to actually measure on any one of those dimensions? Or are we actually trying to teach to those dimensions and measuring the things we've always measured and just say that they're actually performing better because we're doing so that you're not trying to measure how you're not trying to get a resilience measure. You're actually just trying to think about how you would cultivate resilience, and then you're basically measuring the kinds of output that you would measure by other sorts of academic measures. And I think that that's a really important question. Like, I don't want to replicate the disaggregated world by creating disaggregated measures. So I would say two things that come to mind that feel quite fundamental, and I think Ruth Crick's work gets at this too. One is openness to learning, and to develop a notion of what it means to be sort of open to learning and to be able to kind of reset yourself in a context around whether it's being open to others or being open to knowledge or understanding the limits of your own knowledge. But this notion of openness became a very transcendent dimension for her. And then I think resilience. Resilience is also really critical. And I think especially given an expanded population, many of whom are coming out of complicated family situations, ravaged school systems, kinds of things. Sometimes starting and stopping multiple times in the journey. So, and so I think resilience can be taught at the problem-solving level, but it has this kind of constantly solving level. So those are two that I think are really important dimensions: is openness and resilience.
How are you? Is there any way in particular? I know you're still in the stages of getting started with this broader initiative that you're leading. How are you currently thinking of assessing resilience? What does it look like to say a student is resilient versus not?
Right now, it's all basically qualitative, though that's one of my interests in the reflection parsing work, to see if we can get some quantitative and qualitative. And it's really in students, the students report, well, there's two ways. One, the students report of their, so it's basically student narrative. And then I think the other is we have a badging initiative that we were working on, and the badge that the students designed, was designed as a badge called the Catalyst Badge, which was meant to be a way of measuring, of badging students for undertaking a single activity and seeing it through to a level of impact. And so it was partially trying to work against the culture of students doing lessons. And that's a 360-degree peer assessment. That's also trying to measure a person's ability to stick with a task and see it through the impact. So I think at first it's really sources of qualitative data that perhaps could be then quantified in different ways. But I mean, I know there's resilience scales, but I don't know that we think that you can measure changes in. I don't think we're going to find really meaningful changes in that in the 4 years we have them. I think that resilience is one of those really deep kinds of things that has to be in context.
I'm just curious to make that statement. That I think it's Catherine's work, but it's all part of the work of Davidson we were visiting in Wisconsin. And that was that actually short-term interventions or short-term practices do seem to have an impact on performance, whether it's academic or stress reduction or otherwise. So I wonder if we potentially couldn't make good progress with short-scale resilience practices, even in a short 4-year cycle.
I think that's probably true. I think, yeah. So I think it probably is true. And but whether you're measuring the impact of the resilience intervention or whether you're actually getting a resilience measure, to me, is the difference. So I'm interested in are you measuring resilience?
So not currently. I'm particularly interested in looking at short-term trainings, and so then from there measuring. My particular interest right now is in sort of this adaptive response in anxiety, so reduction in anxiety and attention regulation. Those are my specific interests in this one project that we're developing. And so from there it'd be interesting. I mean, that's kind of a short-term study that would be, a 5-day training and see the impact of potential brief trainings. But I think there's talk within Link of kind of expanding this to a longitudinal, so, get them, incoming freshmen, implement these trainings and see how they develop over the course of their time at university.
I'm wondering also if you, let me just throw one thing out. To me, what I'm really interested in, and I've done some work on this on writing transfer, but the notion of learning transfer, and I think that one of the things that I'm really interested in is whether or not certain supports can develop things like resilience that then you can have evidence of transfer to new situations. So, John Bransford used to talk about not thinking of transfer as loss of learning from one context to another, but your ability to learn in a new situation. And so to me, something like resilience measures would have to be, how well are you preparing people to act more resiliently in some future situation? And that to me would be evidence. It's in the notion of transfer. So I think the short-term intervention is incredibly interesting and powerful, but to me, it would also need to be complemented by some sense of how you measure transfer, and especially in some sort of authentic, unscripted or uncertain context. And I don't know how to do that.
Have you just simply correlated your measures to academic outcomes to have any sort of hard evidence?
We've done a certain amount of that, and we now are in a position to do it in a more interesting way because now we have all 4 years, although we haven't tracked the same group. So we've done some of that. And I would say one of the interesting things we've learned is that we haven't learned anything deeply interesting yet. I mean, there's, which makes me wonder about several things, including, we did learn that entering students in the School of Business were lower on every measure upon coming into the university. So that was one interesting difference. But there's actually very little difference. I mean, now we're trying to dig deep into some subpopulations. But at first, there was actually very little difference. And I think one of the things we learned was that we must be filtering at admissions at a certain level, that the students are all basically very similar on many measures when they come in. So we found found correlations between actually higher levels of creativity on the modest measures and openness and lower GPA in the first semester among certain populations, but not huge amounts and not in a little bit on race, ethnicity, nothing on gender, etc. So all those simple things, but now we're trying to look at both. One thing we haven't had, which we're now moving toward, is getting all of the data into the system of who's involved in what co-curricular activities. So in part, all we really had data on was academic stuff because it was all in the system. But we don't know who did alternative spring break and who's doing service learning and who's doing internships and undergraduate research, et cetera. And our sense is that around a lot of these measures, it's not your academic journey that really changes you, it's your co-curricular activities. So we're trying to get to a place where we can look for correlations against as full a range of what the student experiences. So we're still hopeful, but it could be that it's not the right instrument. So we're also looking to that.
One of the things really, just as we're always looking for ways to engage with people who are doing things that overlap with ours and the ability to broaden and impact without doubling the effort. So it's just an FYI to think about, so no answer required, but one of the things that might be worth talking about is as we plan what we're looking at doing as a 4-year study here on campus, partly using wearables, but also trying to get at a range of factors that currently aren't really being assessed within the university experience. The option for us to share with you as our thinking on that solidifies, whether that's something that you want to run simultaneously at Georgetown and have some of the analysis work being done together. And so there's a little bit of different student population and different context as well. So that's something that might be worth a follow-up conversation.
Yeah, that'd be great. And the work that you're doing, I mean, you talked to me some about it this morning. Are you trying to correlate like the work around wearables and biometrics and various kinds of things like that to academic performance? I mean, I know in sort of short-term tasks, but are you trying to sort of map that across students' performance over semesters? Or
right now, there's a stage we're at now. Certainly, we do want to. So that's a short answer, and that's one of the things we're trying to see a broadened focus that runs longer. It's one thing, and this is where I think an integrative approach starts to become relevant. So we have Dave Snowden, who you might be familiar with his work on complexity science. He's joining us for a couple of days this next week. And so our interest is on the systemic and the holistic view. So part of that is going to be academic performance. And there's a relationship between, how do you feel about yourself and the kinds of risks that you're willing to take. There's also a number of other factors, such as a life change. If something happens, you're in a relationship, your relationship ends, how do you respond in terms of whether it's resilience or in terms of coping or whatever else? I mean, so quite often with students is the delta that happens, or in their behaviors when you're building predictive models in particular. You're not looking at just a trajectory, but you're looking at, can you flag a deviance of existing trajectory in terms of which indicates something of substance happened. Maybe it's like you said, they've met it. It doesn't always have to be negative. They got involved in extracurricular activities and it changed their self-confidence, and boom, they had this huge positive opportunity. So I think going forward, and keep in mind we're talking very formative stages. We'll have something much more solidified, certainly by the fall semester, but we'd like to see a range of factors and variables that are both academic, but that very much fit into that whole person learning framework. And that gets at some of the things you said initially, that we'd have to first define what's the whole person framework that we're trying to understand, because personal well-being is one factor. And this may be a bit of an issue in that someone like Davidson, who is, he's got sort of 4 quadrants that his interest is in work and life and learning and university education, K-12 education, in those areas. But I don't know if there's been something I would look at as a framework that we could adopt wholesale without some modifications to it, in terms of what does it mean to be a successful graduate of Georgetown or successful graduate of UTA over a 4-year cycle. What are we looking for as success metrics? And when do we start nudging or influencing behavior academically, socially, developmentally, and so on? All of which is to say we're interested in all of it. The benefit of wearables is it gets us a layer of data that we've never had before, unless we did observational studies. That would get some level, but and it gives you potentially integrative data where you could look at SIS and LMS and wearable and existing observational data and so on. So you could have an interesting big/thick data approach if we constructed it well to run over a 4 years.
It's really interesting. And one of the things, you said think about it, which I will. I'm just going to say something that did just come to mind. That's that we just got a gift/grant to focus on success of underrepresented students, first-generation students in STEM. And it has several pieces of it, including a first summer residency and then academic support. But one of the pieces is to build an online community and knowledge reinforcement program for rising sophomores, because there's a lot of good data that shows that summer knowledge melt between the first and second year is also kind of the last major hazard for access students in STEM. And many of them go back to contexts that it's conducive than other socioeconomic status to kind of stay in the game. So one thing that's really interesting is, we're going to try to build this online community where students would take a module, they'll get stipends to be part of this, and they'll reinforce their knowledge based on things they learned the first year. But it's also interesting to think about how you could help students learn to recover and maintain a feeling of belonging in a university setting when they're not in that university setting. Like what are sort of the full sensory dimensions of remembering what it's like to think of yourself as a learner and as a successful student when you're not in school, in a place where your sense of yourself as a succeeder is vulnerable or fragile. It just seems really interesting to think about the kind of sensory data at that level.
Questions, comments from others? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, what you told us is really exciting and provoking. I'm trying to understand how to take this and apply this to the engineering domain, because we focus on liberal education. And a lot of the things are things that we worry in engineering. But one of the fundamental foundations of this is first is the person who is coming in, is the student itself. So have you looked on why do the students want to be at the university? Because there are various reasons why the students want to be at the university, and their experiences coming in, and then how they can be integrated to all these teams and say, George is going to be really better off in this university environment if he networks. I would be better off if I have somebody who is going to force me to be more engaged because I'm shy or whatever. So how have you looked at the input raw data, how they can relate to this? And what is this, the student body that I guess you have at Georgetown might be completely different than what you have here at UTA. The numbers, the capabilities, and so on. So when you study the incoming experience and the reasons for being there, because one of the things that I struggle in engineering is, why are the students here?
Yeah.
They really come to class and they don't care because they think the computer will do it for them. They don't understand that it's a tool. Right? You know, I tell them the computer is stupid and they look at me like I'm nuts, like I'm an idiot.
That the computers.
Yes. So I say, you program it to tell you 1 + 1 is 20. Every time you put 1 + 1, it's going to spit out 20. And they're like, really? So what is the raw data, the input, if you want to call it, to all these experiments? Because if we don't understand the input when it comes in, how are we going to massage all this to get the input where we want it to go?
Well, I mean, we've looked at that some, and but like you say, I think that the people who are choosing and getting into Georgetown, for the most part, already have a certain sense of themselves in a certain kind of context. But I've done a lot of work, for example, national work on e-portfolios, and we just finished a 3-year project working with 23 schools, half of which were community colleges and some universities. Many of them are actually using ePortfolio, trying to connect ePortfolios to first-year experiences in order to basically open up that question, to get students to think about why are they here, what are their goals, and to try to get everybody to think quite robustly about their education, and to not think instrumentally or to build a sense of efficacy. So I think that's really very contextual to a place. But I think that's again part of the responsibility of an institution is to not make the assumption that students will just be okay coming out the other end, but to see that we actually have this responsibility to program in kind of holistic approach from the beginning. Which is, I don't know if you guys have a first year experience that students are all part of that's deliberately integrative. I mean, there's amazing research, including especially with at-risk populations on the impact of an integrated first-year experience. And
I will say the one thing we have, which may be different from some universities, is over half of the students in most of our degree programs, undergraduate degree programs, are transfers. So they come in, they don't have a first-year experience with us, but they have a 1.5 or 2.5 year experience, which is sometimes extremely difficult.
Well,
so, I mean, that's just part of the
right, but it would be easy enough to replicate what the spirit of a first-year experience is for transfers, which is really to get people to think about what are they going to do with their remaining time? What does it look like to be someone who's coming out on the other end with goals, etc.
And we don't do that at all, frankly. I mean,
there are some of those. I've seen some research on doing that. Not here, but I mean, I've seen research on doing that at other institutions, this idea of the transfer kind of first year experience, to provide that for them.
I mean, I know that there's lots of barriers to this on all levels, including financial, but one of our premises, as we talk through even these 4 strategies for rebundling, is that as the options for learning things starts to proliferate around us, the options for people not to go to a university to learn something, we have to maximize what it is that we can do distinctively at universities. And we haven't done that because we had a relative monopoly on educating people. So, but I think the pressure is on us to, we think of it as that there's a very particular kind of learning that we value in a university that's broader than a lot of other people. And there are distinctive things about a university to cultivate that kind of learning. So not paying attention to transfer students is one of those things that is just something that shouldn't be professionally defensible. Not having an integrated first-year experience that tries to think about the whole development of underrepresented populations who are coming in with very different kinds of social capital, when there's tons of evidence what a difference it makes to their retention, ought to be professionally indefensible. So, I just think the pressure is on us to do that. And even if you take a purely financial look at it, if you look at the schools that are part of the University Innovation Alliance, which are all these large state universities, Oregon State, et cetera, Colorado State, they have reaped millions of dollars of tuition revenue from just raising retention of students from implementing good practices of integrated services and scaffolding and integrated advising. So even financially, there's no reason not to do it. So it's really about taking responsibility for the things we know that work.
How do you get faculty to buy into this idea?
Well, I think like anything, there is no single faculty on who is willing to do this. I think, I think you work with the faculty for whom they appreciate the benefits of working integratively. But I was showing, I didn't show you today, but I have a little construct that actually my wife created. She's a biology professor, that has 3 different colored circles that represent knowledge of the domain, knowledge of the world, and knowledge of the self, and talking about trying to work at the intersection of those. And the knowledge of the domain is blue. I was showing this construct when I was speaking at a university, and one faculty member there said, I don't get what you're talking about. My job is to teach blue. I do blue. That's what I was hired to do, was to teach the domain stuff. But I think that there's plenty of faculty who appreciate the argument that a more integrative approach creates better thinkers in the domain. And I think that's the most important thing, which is why the intervention research that you're doing, and that's what I think we're counting on, is to try to take this extremely integrated approach, taking a dispositional approach to teaching disciplinary knowledge, makes disciplinary or interdisciplinary domain learning deeper and better. And I think that's where you need to focus on the sort of macro level proof. And there it's just about, then we have a long conversation about how you get faculty engaged. It's about rational economic choices, rewards and supports, thought leaders and things like that. And I don't know I'm curious how you feel if you think that your faculty here would respond to thinking about the whole person, or do you think
At least a third of them would, and maybe 2/3. That's my guess.
at least a third would and maybe 2/3?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
crap, you can have a revolution with a third. That's
No,
plenty.
I would be fairly
2/3,
optimistic.
my God.
And maybe that's just my nature, but I think that the way you framed it in terms of it makes better thinkers within the domain that they're comfortable with,
Yeah.
I think that is something they would respond.
Well, and even this program that I mentioned where we do these modules around student well-being that connects to that, even those, we have faculty who would not really go near a pedagogical workshop if their life depended on it, who are active in this, who will just say, when I do this module where they can construct this 1-week module to make this personal connection, say, to existential philosophy, who will just say they're just doing better existential philosophy the rest of the semester because we had this unit where he has them write, letters about the challenges of flourishing in college and, applying philosophical principles to their own struggles and stuff. It just says they're just better at philosophy after that, better at calculus after that.
We're just after the top of the hour, so I know I have to get Randy to the airport shortly. So just join me in thanking Randy for spending some time thinking with us, and look forward to future conversations. So thank you.